There is a family in Atlanta, Georgia, whose name is written on university buildings, hospital wings, engineering schools, and concert halls across an entire city. The Woodruffs. Theirs was the family that built Coca-Cola into a global empire, then gave so much of that fortune away that Atlanta itself became a kind of monument to their generosity. The Woodruff Arts Center, Woodruff Park, the Robert W. Woodruff Library, name after name, inscribed in stone. But somewhere behind all of that marble and brass is a story most people have never heard. One that involves a father who cut one of his daughters out of his will while giving away hundreds of millions to strangers, and a woman who spent more than 4 years inside a psychiatric facility because she married someone he didn't approve of. The Woodruff name is synonymous with generosity, but generosity, it turns out, can be a very complicated thing when you're the one on the wrong side of it. The empire that built a family. To understand the daughters, you have to understand where the money came from. And to understand that, you have to go back to 1919, to a deal that would shape an entire city. Coca-Cola, by that point, had been around for more than 3 decades. A pharmacist named John Pemberton had mixed the original syrup in Atlanta in 1886, selling it for 5 cents a glass at Jacob's Pharmacy on Peachtree Street. The formula was a local curiosity at first, a mixture of carbonated water and a dark, sweet syrup whose precise ingredients Pemberton kept to himself. He sold the rights before he died, and an Atlanta businessman named Asa Candler acquired full control, and in 1892 incorporated the Coca-Cola Company as a formal enterprise. Candler was a gifted promoter. He gave away coupons for free Cokes to get people hooked. He distributed branded merchandise, clocks, calendars, trays, to put the name in front of as many eyes as possible. By the time the 20th century arrived, Coca-Cola was no longer a local curiosity. It was a national product. And by 1919, Asa Candler was ready to sell. The price was $25 million, an enormous sum at the time, and a group of Atlanta investors, led by a banker named Ernest Woodruff, came together to make the purchase. Ernest Woodruff was not a man who did anything quietly. He had built a career reorganizing companies, taking struggling businesses, restructuring them, and extracting value in ways that other men hadn't managed to see. He had led the trust company of Georgia for years, accumulated directorships across Atlanta's industrial landscape, and developed the kind of reputation that makes other serious men take your phone calls. When he decided Coca-Cola was worth buying, the other investors followed him in. The $25 million changed hands. The Woodruffs became Coca-Cola's controlling family. And 4 years later, in 1923, Ernest did something that demonstrated either enormous confidence in his son or enormous desperation about the company's condition. He installed his 33-year-old son, Robert, as president. The company at that moment was not in good shape. Its stock had fallen from $40 a share to $18. It owed money. It had made bad decisions. Robert Woodruff, who had been making a successful career at the White Motor Company in Cleveland and had no particular desire to run a soft drink company, took the job anyway. He later explained his reasoning in characteristically dry terms. He had borrowed money to buy Coca-Cola stock at $40 a share, and he figured that becoming president was the most direct way to get the price back up so he could sell and break even. He never sold. What Robert Woodruff did over the next 60 years at Coca-Cola is one of the great stories in American business history. He took a struggling regional company and turned it into something that Time magazine would eventually describe as having made a peaceful near conquest of the world. He established an international department in 1926, the first formal structure for pushing the product beyond America's borders. He survived the Depression. Coca-Cola's profits actually rose every single year through the 1930s because, as Woodruff observed, everyone has a nickel. He standardized quality across every bottling plant and demanded the same product in Savannah as in London. He understood, before most businessmen of his era, that a brand was not just a product. It was a feeling, a memory, a piece of identity that you could make people believe they needed. He made one of the canniest moves in marketing history during World War II, promising to deliver 5-cent Cokes to every American serviceman wherever they were stationed in the world. The promise was extraordinary. The logistics of keeping it were more extraordinary still. Coca-Cola was exempted from sugar rationing to make it possible. 64 bottling plants were set up in war zones across Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and Asia. Soldiers drank it in foxholes in Italy, in tents in the Pacific Islands, in bases across North Africa. The company spent $55 million on these war operations, most of which was not recovered. Woodruff considered it the best investment the company ever made. He was right. When the war ended, those bottling plants kept running. The soldiers who had grown up drinking Coke came home and kept drinking it. The people in Europe and Asia and North Africa who had tasted it for the first time during the war remembered it as something associated with American prosperity and the end of terrible years. By 1968, half of Coca-Cola's net profits were coming from overseas operations. Robert Woodruff had taken a company that owed money in 1923 and turned it into a global empire. He stepped down as president in 1954, but remained on the board until 1984. 60 years of continuous influence, shaping the most recognized consumer product on Earth. He never had children. That fact matters more than it might seem. Robert Woodruff and his wife Nell, who had given up a nursing career to marry him, were childless throughout their long marriage. All of that wealth, all of that influence, when it was time for it to pass somewhere, it went to universities and hospitals and arts centers and a foundation that still bears his name. Robert Woodruff gave away an estimated $350 million during his lifetime, most of it anonymously. When he gave Emory University 3 million shares of Coca-Cola stock in 1979, a gift worth approximately $100 million at the time, it was the largest single donation to a university in American history, and he arranged it so that his name wouldn't be attached publicly. But Robert was not the only Woodruff with Coca-Cola in his blood. He had a brother, and the brother had daughters, 3 daughters, in fact. And the story of what happened to those 3 women, what was given to them, what was taken from them, and what one of them had to fight like hell to recover, is where this story really begins. George and his 3 daughters. George Waldo Woodruff was born in 1895, 6 years after his famous brother Robert. He grew up in the same household, absorbed the same lessons about hard work and ambition, and the peculiar Atlanta conviction that a man's worth was measured by what he built, and he followed a path through the same Atlanta institutions: Georgia Tech, then World War I service in the Army Medical Corps, then a career in business that was substantial by any measure outside the shadow of his brother's legend. George was never the public face of the family the way Robert was. While Robert was the man with the title, president of Coca-Cola, the one whose name appeared in newspapers, George operated further from the spotlight, in a style that suited him. He became president of the Continental Gin Company in 1930, a cotton processing business, and he ran it for the next 55 years. He served as a director of the Coca-Cola Company from 1936 to 1985. 49 years on the board, a presence at the table through every major decision the company made in the post-war era, without ever holding an officer's title. He was, in the language of the boardroom, an insider, the kind of man who didn't need a title to have weight. He married a woman named Irene Tift King in April 1918, shortly before heading off to war, and the two of them built a life in Atlanta that was, by the standards of their milieu, quiet and respectable, and shaped by money so old and established that it no longer needed to announce itself. They had three daughters: Jane, Irene, named for her mother, and Frances. The world they raised their daughters in was a particular kind of Atlanta world. The Woodruffs were not simply wealthy people in a wealthy city. They were the family around which a significant portion of Atlanta's civic identity organized itself. Robert's philanthropy was reshaping the city's hospitals and universities in real time. George's board position kept the family connected to the most powerful corporation in Georgia. The name Woodruff opened doors that most people in America in the mid-20th century could not even find, let alone knock on. Growing up inside that name was a form of privilege so total that it could be difficult to see from inside it, and a form of pressure, equally total, that came with expectations attached. Atlanta, in the middle of the 20th century, was a city with a defined social architecture. There were families you came from and families you didn't, schools you attended and schools that were beneath you, ways of carrying yourself that signaled membership in the right tier of things. The Woodruff daughters were near the very top of that architecture, which meant that the code governing their behavior was correspondingly rigid. You married the right kind of person. You maintained the right kind of profile. You did not embarrass the family. Jane, the eldest daughter, attended Washington Seminary for high school, a prestigious Atlanta girls' school, and went on to Mount Vernon College in Washington, D.C. She developed interests in art and travel, and maintained the low public profile that the family seemed to regard as a form of good breeding. She was, by all accounts, the quietest of the three. Irene, the middle daughter, followed a similar path. She eventually married a man named Alfred Benjamin Michael and settled into a life in Florida, keeping herself largely out of public view in the way that wealthy Southern women of her generation often did. Present at the right occasions, invisible to anyone who wasn't already in the room. And then there was Frances. Frances went by the nickname Tut. It is unclear exactly where the nickname came from, but it stuck with her throughout her life. In newspaper accounts, in court documents, in the mouths of people who had strong feelings about her, which turned out to be almost everyone who knew her well. Frances Woodruff was the youngest daughter, and she was, from an early age, the one who did not fit the mold that her father had in mind. What Frances did, and what her father did in response, set off a chain of events that would end in courtrooms, in a psychiatric facility in Florida, and ultimately in a legal battle that forced one of Atlanta's most powerful families to air its private wounds in public. But to understand why it happened, you have to understand what the Woodruffs expected of the women in their family. A marriage that changed everything. The story of Frances Tut Woodruff and her father is, at its core, a story about control. But it is also a story about the particular way that wealthy families in mid-century America managed their daughters. How the same institutions that produced generosity toward the public could produce something considerably less generous toward the people closest to them. George Woodruff was a man who had spent his entire adult life managing things: companies, investments, board positions, the slow accumulation of power and influence in a city where those things were earned and held carefully. He was not, by any account, a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He was a philanthropist who gave tens of millions of dollars to universities and medical institutions. He sat on the boards of schools and hospitals and civic organizations. He was, in the language of Atlanta's mid-century establishment, a man of standing, a serious man, a man whose opinion carried weight in rooms that mattered. But men of standing, in the world George Woodruff inhabited, had certain expectations about their families, expectations about the kind of lives their children would lead, the kind of people their children would marry, the kind of order that wealth required to sustain itself across generations. These expectations were not spoken aloud, typically. They didn't need to be. They were ambient, present in the schools attended, the friends approved of, the events attended and not attended, the subtle and not so subtle communications about what was acceptable and what was not. And when Frances, his youngest daughter, was 19 years old, she got married to someone her father did not approve of. The historical record does not preserve much detail about the man Frances chose, or about the precise nature of her father's objection to him. What the record does preserve, in court documents, in news accounts from the 1980s, and in Frances's own statements to reporters, is what happened afterward. George Woodruff cut Frances out, not immediately and not quietly. The estrangement, by Frances's own account, began with the marriage and continued through the divorce that followed in 1960. That divorce, rather than softening her father's position, seemed to harden it. By that point, Frances had 4 children of her own. In the years after her marriage ended, Frances found herself not reconciled with her family, but increasingly isolated from the protective structures that wealth provides. She was in her late 30s, divorced, with children to support, and the family fortune that surrounded her was not available to her in any meaningful way. And then things got considerably worse. In 1967, Frances Woodruff was formally declared mentally incompetent by a court. She was subsequently committed to a psychiatric facility in Florida, where she would remain for more than 4 years. The legal proceedings that produced that outcome were, according to the lawsuit she later filed, not what they appeared. Frances told reporters that she believed her father had coerced doctors at Emory University, where he was, by that point, a significant financial contributor, into supporting the declaration of incompetency. She claimed the condition attributed to her was the result of epilepsy, not of any impairment that justified removing her legal rights and her freedom. She said, plainly and without apparent bitterness, that she was absolutely certain she would never have left that facility if not for her mother. Irene Tift King Woodruff, the woman who had given up her own life to build the Woodruff household, who had raised 3 daughters in the orbit of Atlanta's most powerful family, refused to accept her youngest daughter's situation. She pushed. She advocated. She is described in the accounts of this period as the person whose determination made Frances's release possible. Her mother's intervention worked. Frances challenged the incompetency finding through the courts and in 1973 won the restoration of her legal competency. She came back to Atlanta. She built a life unconventional by the standards of her family, but hers. She ran a hang gliding school in the mountains of northern Georgia at some point, which, given the backdrop of everything that had happened to her, has a quality of deliberate defiance about it. It is not the kind of enterprise one associates with the daughters of a man worth $200 million. It is, however, the kind of enterprise one might build if the message received from your family for 2 decades had been that you didn't belong to them. George Woodruff, meanwhile, went on doing what wealthy Atlanta patriarchs did. He gave money to Georgia Tech. He sat on the Coca-Cola board. He and Frances remained estranged, and in 1979 he went to court to obtain an injunction barring her from entering his house, on the grounds that his wife was in ill health and Frances's visits were disruptive to her care. Irene Tift King Woodruff died in 1982. The woman who had fought to free her daughter from a psychiatric facility was gone. And in 1984, Forbes magazine estimated George Woodruff's net worth at $200 million. He was 91 years old when he died on February 4th, 1987. And what he left behind, or more precisely, what he chose not to leave Francis, became the most public chapter of this family's private war. The will and its aftermath. George Waldo Woodruff's 9-page will was filed in Fulton County Probate Court on February 9th, 1987, 5 days after his death. The document made his intentions unmistakably clear. To his daughter Jane, approximately $30 million. To his daughter Irene, approximately $30 million. To Georgia Tech, Emory University, Mercer University, and several other educational and medical institutions, $150 million. The Georgia Tech Foundation alone received $37.5 million. At the time, the largest private gift the school had ever received. The George W. Woodruff School of Mechanical Engineering at Georgia Tech was named in his honor. The will was, in the parlance of philanthropy, an extraordinarily generous document. Universities and medical schools across Georgia would benefit for generations. His name would be inscribed on buildings that would stand for a century. The public story of George Woodruff's death was the story of a great benefactor. To his daughter Frances, a trust fund of $200,000 to be used only to provide food, shelter, and clothing, in the event she became completely destitute. The will also included a provision that if Frances challenged it, the $200,000 would be redirected to her daughter Martha. It was the kind of clause that communicates something beyond mere legal strategy. It was a message. It said, "I know you might fight this, and if you do, I will take even this small thing from your own child." It was the last move in a decades-long campaign conducted from a position of almost total power, aimed at a woman who had spent 4 years in a psychiatric facility and another 14 years rebuilding a life without any help from her father's fortune. Frances read the will. She told reporters what she thought of it, in terms that were simple and direct. She said it hurt her deeply, that she couldn't imagine treating her own children that way, and that in her opinion it was not how things were meant to be. Then she hired a lawyer. The legal challenge she filed made several arguments. One was that her father had suffered from what the lawsuit called monomania, an obsessive fixation, in this case manifesting as an irrational conviction that Frances and her 4 children wished to cause him harm. The lawsuit argued that this obsession had distorted his judgment and rendered the will invalid. Court documents cited his decision to have her committed and his long-standing refusal to reconcile as evidence of a pattern of behavior rooted in something beyond ordinary family conflict. The lawsuit also pointed to the 1979 court injunction barring her from his house as further evidence of an irrational and extreme estrangement. The legal arguments were not simply procedural maneuvers. They amounted to a public account of what had been done to her, a daughter's version of a family history that her father had spent decades controlling. Whatever the legal outcome, the filing of the suit put on public record things that the Woodruff family had kept private for a long time. The case attracted significant attention in Atlanta. A trial, if it happened, would have meant airing decades of Woodruff family history in public. The committed daughter, the coerced doctors, the estrangement that spanned most of Frances's adult life, all of it laid out for examination in a courtroom. That prospect, apparently, was enough to move the other parties to negotiate. The settlement, which was ordered sealed by the court in October 1987, was reported at $17 million gross. After taxes and legal fees, Frances Woodruff walked away with approximately $10 million. Her 2 sisters, along with the educational institutions named in the will, had contributed to the settlement fund to avoid the trial. The arrangement meant that Jane and Irene each ended up with somewhat less than the $30 million their father had intended them to have. The institutions gave up portions of their bequests. And Frances, who had been offered $200,000 on the condition that she never made trouble, received 50 times that amount because she made trouble anyway. When it was over, Frances told a reporter, "Praise the Lord, it's over." She added that she intended to divide whatever she left behind equally among her own children, that any inheritance, in her view, should be split fairly, without conditions attached. It was a statement made quietly, but with considerable weight behind it, coming from a woman who knew better than almost anyone what the alternative looked like. The settlement closed the legal chapter of the Woodruff family dispute, but the story of what the Woodruff name came to mean, in Atlanta, across America, and in the buildings and institutions that still carry it, is a separate story, and in many ways, a stranger one. What the name bought. Walk through certain parts of Atlanta today, and the name Woodruff appears with a frequency that starts to feel less like tribute and more like wallpaper. There is the Woodruff Arts Center on Peachtree Street, which houses the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, the Alliance Theater, and the High Museum of Art, a complex that opened in 1968 and was renamed for Robert Woodruff in 1982, over what friends said would have been his objection had he been healthy enough to stop it. There is Woodruff Park in the heart of downtown, a public green space in the middle of the city's business district. There are two Robert W. Woodruff libraries, one serving Emory University, one serving the Atlanta University Center Consortium of historically black colleges and universities, including Morehouse and Spelman. There is the Nell Hodgson Woodruff School of Nursing at Emory, named for Robert's wife. There is the Robert W. Woodruff Health Sciences Center. And over at Georgia Tech, there is the George W. Woodruff School of Mechanical Engineering, the university's oldest and second largest school, named for the brother whose daughters were fighting over his estate at roughly the same time the building was being dedicated in 1985. The philanthropic record of the two Woodruff brothers is, taken at face value, remarkable. In 1979, Robert and George together gave Emory University 3 million shares of Coca-Cola stock, $105 million, the largest donation to a university in American history at the time. Robert's lifetime giving is estimated at $350 million. George's considerable, if smaller, record of giving went to Georgia Tech, Emory, Mercer, and a range of Atlanta civic institutions. Between the two of them, they reshaped the institutional landscape of a city. Much of Robert's giving was famously anonymous. He kept on his desk a phrase that he treated as something close to a personal creed. There is no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. He was known in Atlanta as the anonymous donor. When he helped cover the costs of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Nobel Peace Prize dinner in Atlanta in 1964, ensuring that the city's business community would show up and make the event a success despite the racial tensions of the era, he did it without fanfare or public acknowledgement. When the Winship Cancer Institute grew out of his early gifts to Emory's medical school, a gift originally made to honor his mother, who died of cancer, the formal naming came later, attached to a legacy that had been building for decades. The buildings and institutions named for him came largely after his death or were named by others over his objection. He didn't seem to want the marble. He wanted the thing the marble was supposed to celebrate: the actual functioning of hospitals, the actual education of students, the actual existence of an arts center in a city that hadn't had one. But philanthropy and family are not the same thing. Robert's childlessness meant that his fortune went into institutions rather than people. George's daughters, the 3 women who had grown up inside the empire, who had attended its schools and moved in its social world, found themselves, in the end, positioned very differently depending on which one they were. Jane and Irene received their $30 million each, lived their quiet lives, and were not, as far as any public record suggests, asked to justify themselves or fight for what their father had allocated. Their names appear occasionally on the buildings and programs that their father endowed, a residential centre at Emery bears George and Irene's name jointly, but they lived, as they had always lived, away from the noise. Frances got the fight of her life, and ultimately a fraction of what her sisters received. The question of what the Woodruff daughters' story says about how wealth moves through families, and about who gets to carry the name while others carry the burden, doesn't have a clean answer. But it has an honest one: the Coca-Cola stock and its long shadow. It is worth pausing on the Coca-Cola stock itself, because that stock is the thread running through everything in this story. When Ernest Woodruff's consortium bought the company in 1919 for $25 million, the stock was selling at $40 a share and quickly fell to 18. Robert Woodruff borrowed money to buy shares because he believed in the company's future. And when he became president in 1923, one of his explicit goals was to get the stock price back to where he'd paid for it so he could sell and break even. He never sold. He spent 60 years pouring himself into the thing instead. By the time of his death in 1985, those shares were worth vastly more than anything a number in 1923 could have predicted. Coca-Cola stock became, over the course of the 20th century, one of the great wealth-generating instruments in American financial history. Patient, compounding, spreading its value across generations of shareholders who held it long enough. The Coca-Cola stock that Robert and George gave to Emery in 1979, 3 million shares, valued at around $105 million at the time, has appreciated enormously in the decades since. Emery became one of the largest individual shareholders in the Coca-Cola Company, and the endowment that grew from that gift helped make the university's financial position one of the strongest among private universities in America. It was the single largest donation to a university in American history when it was made. It came, ultimately, from the same source as everything else in this story: from a formula mixed in an Atlanta pharmacy in 1886, from a deal made in 1919, from a family that understood before almost anyone else how far a brown bottle of syrup could travel. George Woodruff's estate, worth an estimated $200 million by the mid-1980s, was also substantially composed of Coca-Cola holdings accumulated over decades of family ownership. The $30 million allocated to Jane and the $30 million allocated to Irene were fortunes built, at their root, on syrup and sugar water, and the genius of a marketing operation that had convinced half the world that a particular brown drink was synonymous with happiness. Frances's settlement of $17 million, the number before taxes and fees, the $10 million she actually received, came from the same pot. A pot that her father had chosen, deliberately and legally, to deny her. The irony is not lost. The company whose name appears in every corner of Atlanta's civic life, whose stock built the hospitals, the arts centers, the engineering schools, is the same company whose wealth, in the hands of George W. Woodruff, was used as an instrument of disinheritance. The gift to Georgia Tech of $37.5 million came from the same estate that offered Frances $200,000 and a warning not to make trouble. The Woodruff Foundation that Robert established continues to this day, making grants across Georgia with the accumulated wealth of that original empire. The daughters of George Woodruff are largely absent from the public record after the settlement. But what happened to them is part of the story too, the part that the buildings don't tell. What Atlanta remembers. Atlanta in the 20th century was a city that understood the power of a story told well. It was a city that had rebuilt itself after the Civil War, that had positioned itself as the capital of the New South, that had cultivated a self-image as progressive and prosperous and forward-looking. The Woodruffs were central to that story, not just as wealthy donors, but as the men who made Atlanta a city with world-class universities and a symphony orchestra and a hospital system that people didn't have to leave town to use. Robert Woodruff, in particular, became something of a civic myth in his own lifetime. Atlanta's mayors called him Boss. His opinion was sought on questions ranging from urban development to racial politics. He was quietly influential in the city's decision to formally honor Martin Luther King Jr. after the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, at a moment when much of white Atlanta's business community was resistant to the idea. He existed at the intersection of corporate power, philanthropic influence, and political weight in a way that few private citizens have managed in American history. He sat on the boards of major American corporations and was a longtime member of the Business Advisory Council of the U.S. Department of Commerce. His personal reach extended across decades and institutions and relationships that most people never knew existed. The version of the Woodruff story that Atlanta tells itself is the version about all of that. The buildings, the gifts, the anonymous donations, the civic vision. It is a genuinely impressive story. The Woodruff Arts Center is real. The Winship Cancer Institute is real. The generations of Emory and Georgia Tech students whose educations were subsidized by Coca-Cola stock are real. The scholarship programs and endowments and named professorships that continue to function decades after the men who funded them are gone, those are real too. What is also real, and what exists alongside the official version rather than contradicting it, is the story of George Woodruff's daughter Frances. The woman who married the wrong person, was cut off, was committed to a psychiatric facility in Florida for more than 4 years, was offered $200,000 from a $200 million estate on condition that she stay quiet, and had to sue her father's estate to get anything resembling a fair share of what he'd built. Frances Woodruff did not end up in any of the buildings. Her name does not appear on any of the programs or scholarships or engineering schools that bear the Woodruff family name. The settlement was sealed, and she appears to have lived the rest of her life outside the machinery of Atlanta's public memory in a way that her father probably would have preferred, and that she herself may have found something like relief. She came from the same family, breathed the same air, grew up in the same house funded by the same Coca-Cola fortune that endowed universities and reshaped a city. The difference between her and her sisters, in the end, had nothing to do with anything she did to that fortune. It had to do with a marriage her father didn't sanction, and a man's capacity to hold a grudge for the rest of his very long and very well-funded life. The empire is real. The philanthropy is real. And so is this. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Picture a limestone chateau rising above the Dordogne Valley in the south of France. Turrets and gargoyles, gardens terraced into the hillside, a J-shaped swimming pool, a wax museum, a jazz club, a hotel. And somewhere inside all of it, 12 children from 12 different corners of the world, eating breakfast together, speaking 4 languages at once, being photographed by tourists who paid to watch them play leapfrog in the garden. The woman who built this was born in a St. Louis slum, sent to clean houses at 8 years old, and married off for the first time at 13. By the time she was 60, she had become one of the most decorated women in French history, and she had lost the chateau, lost the dream, and watched the family she had spent 2 decades building scatter in every direction. What happened to those 12 children during the dream and after it ended is a story that gets harder to look away from the deeper it goes. The Girl Who Ran. Josephine Baker was born Frida Josephine MacDonald on June 3, 1906, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father, a vaudeville drummer named Eddie Carson, left the family not long after she was born. Her mother, Carrie MacDonald, took in laundry to keep the family fed. There was no indoor plumbing. There were days without enough food. She dropped out of school at 12. By the time she was 8 years old, Josephine had been sent to work as a domestic servant for white families, cleaning, doing laundry, looking after children who were not her own. One employer scalded her hands as punishment for using too much soap. She was still a child. She slept in cellars, on cardboard, when there was nothing better. She danced on street corners with a tin cup out for change. And she was good at it, in the way some people are just born good at something, before anyone teaches them a thing. At 13, she married a man named Willie Wells, a foundry worker she met while waitressing at a club. The marriage lasted weeks. Some accounts say he came at her one night in a rage, and she hit him with a bottle and left. Whatever the circumstances, she was 14 when it was over, and she was back on the street. At 15, she married again, this time a Pullman porter named William Howard Baker. That marriage didn't last either. But she kept the name Baker, a practical decision from a practical young woman who was already building something, even if she couldn't quite see its shape yet. By the early 1920s, she had made her way to New York during the Harlem Renaissance, working chorus lines on Broadway in shows like Shuffle Along and Chocolate Dandies. When she auditioned for a featured role, she was turned away for being too dark and too thin. She took the chorus spot and made herself impossible to ignore, turning up the comedy at the end of the line, going deliberately out of step, drawing the eye by being visibly, defiantly alive. Audiences laughed. Then they came back to see her specifically. In 1925, she was offered a place in La Revue Nègre, a travelling show headed to Paris. She was 19. When the New York skyline disappeared behind her ship, she said later that for the first time in her life she felt she could breathe. Paris received her like a revelation. She performed the Danse Sauvage at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées on October 2nd, 1925, wearing almost nothing, moving in ways the French audience had never seen and couldn't stop talking about. By the following year, she was at the Folies Bergère in a skirt made of artificial bananas, and that image, that particular silhouette, became one of the most recognized in the history of performance. Pablo Picasso painted her. Jean Cocteau designed her promotional materials. Ernest Hemingway called her the most sensational woman anyone had ever seen. By 1927, she was earning more than any other entertainer in Europe. She walked her pet cheetah on a diamond-studded leash through the streets of Paris. She opened a nightclub called Chez Joséphine. She starred in French films. And she moved through all of it with the particular freedom of someone who had been told all her life what she couldn't be, and then stepped off a boat and discovered that the prohibition was geographical. In France, she could sit wherever she wanted, walk into any restaurant, be seen as a performer, not a problem. She became a French citizen in 1937 after marrying industrialist Jean Lion, and she began to use the freedom she had found in France as a mirror to hold up against the country that had refused it. She insisted, from at least the 1930s onward, on performing only for integrated audiences in the United States, and she enforced it in her contracts, which was almost unheard of for a black performer of that era. Club owners who wanted her act had to desegregate for the night or go without. In 1951, she was refused service at the Stork Club in New York. It became a public confrontation that made national headlines and cost her engagements in the United States for years. The incident led to the suspension of her work visa, which kept her out of the country for another decade. But she had been making the argument too loudly and too publicly for the American government to entirely ignore. and they watched her carefully. The FBI maintained a file on her. The CIA tracked her activities. She was accused, in the way that anyone challenging American racial arrangements could be accused in that era, of communist sympathies. She denied it with characteristic bluntness. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, she did not retreat to safety. She joined the French resistance. The work she did during the war was genuinely dangerous. She carried intelligence, names, troop movements, contacts, written in invisible ink on her sheet music, or hidden inside her clothing at borders where any ordinary person would have been stopped. She performed for Allied troops across North Africa and the Middle East, and she worked with both the British Secret Intelligence Service and the American Office of Strategic Services. The full scope of her intelligence work wasn't publicly confirmed until French documents were declassified in 2020. At the war's end, she was awarded the Médaille de la Résistance, the Croix de Guerre, and was named a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur by General Charles de Gaulle himself. This was a woman who did not do things partially. Everything she touched, she threw herself into completely. Which is why what came next was not a surprise to anyone who was paying attention. But no one could quite have imagined the scale of it. And the scale of it is where everything starts to get complicated. The Chateau and the Dream. Josephine Baker first saw the Chateau des Milandes in the 1930s, and the feeling she described was immediate and absolute. The chateau sat above the Dordogne Valley in the Périgord region of southwestern France, a 15th-century building of limestone towers and terraced gardens and stained glass windows that caught the light like cut jewels. She called it her Sleeping Beauty Castle. She rented it first. Then in 1947, after the war was over and she was 41 years old, she bought it. Her fourth husband was Joe Bouillon, a French jazz conductor and band leader. She had married him on June 3rd, 1947, her 41st birthday. Bouillon was steady and organized and genuinely committed to the life Josephine had in mind, at least in the beginning. What she had in mind was a family. They had tried to conceive a child. She had suffered miscarriages. Bouillon later said she had carried one child to near term during the war, a stillbirth in 1941 that had led to an emergency procedure that made further pregnancies impossible. The grief of that sat alongside something else she had been carrying for years, a conviction, sharpened by the war and by a lifetime of fighting American racism, that race was an invented category, that human beings were not naturally divided, that the divisions were taught, and therefore could be untaught. She wanted to prove it, not with speeches, with children. What she described to Bouillon was a living demonstration of universal brotherhood. Children from different countries, different religions, different races, raised together as siblings, showing the world that it could be done. She called it the village of the world, the capital of universal fraternity. She was clear, from the beginning, that this was not only a family, it was an argument. The children began arriving in 1954. From Japan, she brought Akio, a 2-year-old boy. From Korea, though he would be presented publicly as also Japanese, came Teruya, whom she renamed Jano. From Finland came Jari, whom she renamed Jari. A toddler, she said, had reached out his arms to her from his orphanage crib. From Colombia came Luis. From the French welfare system came Jean-Claude. And then Moïse. The child Baker had intended to be the tribe's Jewish representative. Baker had applied to adopt a child from Israel. The Israeli welfare minister refused, explaining that the country could not allow a child to be taken from Israel when such great effort was being made to bring children there. So Baker adopted a French child and raised him Jewish, assigning the faith rather than finding a child who carried it. In 1956 came two children from war-torn Algeria: Brahim, born to Berber parents, whom she renamed Brian, and Marianne, the first daughter, born to a French couple. From the Ivory Coast came Coffee. From Venezuela came Mara. Then Noel, found as an infant in a crib on a Parisian street on Christmas Eve, named for the night he was discovered. And finally, Stellina, abandoned at birth in France by a Moroccan acquaintance of Baker's, the 12th and last. 10 boys and 2 girls. 10 countries and 3 continents. Each child assigned a religion with deliberate care. Janot raised Buddhist, Jerry Protestant, Moise Jewish, Coffee animist. The 2 Algerian children split between Islam and Catholicism so that both traditions would be present. Joe Bouillon wrote them a prayer of brotherhood that they recited together, asking that their siblings across the world might love each other with peace and understanding and tolerance. Baker turned the estate into a destination. By the mid-1950s, Les Mélandes had grown into something between a family home and an exhibition: a hotel, a restaurant, a jazz club, a wax museum narrating Baker's life story, a J-shaped swimming pool, a theatre, a mini golf course, an aviary. Between 1954 and 1960, the estate drew around 300,000 visitors a year, some estimates higher. Tourists paid to walk the grounds and watch the children play. Baker refused proposals to make a film about the family. The children were there, she said, to represent an ideal, not to be turned into a spectacle. The line between an ideal and a spectacle, at a property where paying visitors watched her children from behind a fence, was not always clearly drawn. The children knew what they represented. One of them said later that growing up there, they understood from an early age that they were brothers from different countries, and that their life together was supposed to show the world something. That awareness was both a gift and a weight. Depending on the day, on the year, on the child, it shifted. But underneath the photographs and the tourist receipts and the magazine spreads, the cracks were already forming, and some of them ran very deep. The crack in the dream. The image Baker presented to the world was harmonious. 12 children in the garden, a round table at dinner, private tutors, pets, trips to see the Pope in Rome, an invitation from Fidel Castro to visit Cuba, the Rainbow Tribe as proof of concept, living and laughing in a fairy tale chateau in the Dordogne. The reality underneath was messier, and in one case, genuinely ugly. Joe Bouillon had been trying to hold the finances together since the beginning, and it was a losing battle. Baker performed constantly to fund the estate, the children, the large domestic staff, the renovations that never seemed to end, the hotel, the restaurant, the wax museum, the ongoing vision of a woman who could not stop adding to what she was building. Bouillon brought her the numbers. She looked at them and kept spending. He begged her to slow down. She went back on tour. It was, at its core, the story of 2 people who loved the same dream and could not agree on what it would cost. The religion assignments Baker had given the children also created complications no one had quite planned for. Moise had been raised Jewish, not because he came from a Jewish family, but because the tribe needed a Jewish child, and Baker had been refused an Israeli adoption. He carried a faith that had been chosen for him rather than born in him, a fact that, as he grew older, meant something particular. Janot had been born in Korea, but was publicly identified as Japanese on some occasions, because Akio was already filling the Japanese role in Baker's symbolic arrangement. Jari, adopted in Finland, had been raised Protestant, not because that was his family's tradition, but because the tribe needed a Protestant representative. These were identities assigned by Baker's vision, not by the children's histories. They wore them the way you wear a costume someone else has fitted you for, and sometimes the fit wasn't right, and sometimes the child wearing it knew it wasn't right, and had no way to say so. The children had also been renamed, almost universally, upon adoption. Teruya became Janot, Jari became Jarry, Brahim became Brian. Their birth names went with their birth families, replaced by French names that fit more comfortably inside the story Baker was telling. It was done with good intentions. Most things in this story were done with good intentions. But a child who cannot say their own name in the language it was given is a child who has been asked to leave something behind before they were old enough to know it mattered. Then there was Jari. Jari, born Jari in Finland, adopted at roughly a year old, renamed and raised Protestant, was, by his own later account, aware that he was gay from around the age of 7 or 8. He grew up in a household that had been built on the premise that human beings could transcend the categories others assigned them. A household where a woman who had herself crossed every border that prejudice tried to build around her was the moral centre. When Jari was around 15, Baker discovered him in a private moment with another boy. Her response was not the response of the woman who had marched for civil rights, who had refused to perform in segregated venues, who had been hounded by the FBI for challenging the way America sorted human beings into categories. Her response was fear. She was afraid, reportedly, that Jari's presence would influence his brothers. She told him he had to leave. He was 15 years old. He was sent to live with Joe Bouillon, who by that point had already relocated to Buenos Aires. Jari went to Argentina, to a country where he knew almost no one, in a language he was still learning, separated from the only family he had ever had. Because the woman who had built an entire philosophy around the refusal to reject people for what they were had rejected her own son for what he was. It remains the hardest passage in her story. Baker was bisexual herself. That was never a secret among people who knew her, which makes the decision even more difficult to understand from the outside. Those who have tried to explain it point to the specific fears of the era and to the terror of a woman who felt that one wrong note could unravel the entire argument she was making to the world. The tribe was supposed to be a demonstration. Demonstrations needed to look a certain way. But none of that excuses what she did to a 15-year-old boy who had already had one family that couldn't keep him. Jari eventually found a way to forgive her. He said so, publicly, decades later. But the wound was real, and the path back from it was long. And what came next for Baker, and for all of them, was going to be longer still. The end of Les Milandes. By 1961, Joe Bouillon had reached the end of what he could manage. He left for Buenos Aires, where he opened a restaurant. The formal divorce did not come for years, but the practical separation was done. Les Milandes was now Baker's to run alone, with an estate she could not afford, 12 children in various stages of adolescence, and a performing career that was aging alongside its performer. The debts multiplied faster than the touring income could cover them. In 1964, the chateau was announced for auction. Brigitte Bardot, who had never met Baker, but who appeared on a nationally televised broadcast to appeal directly to the French public, asked viewers to contribute to save the family. The response was large enough. The auction was halted, for a while. By 1968, the finances had collapsed again. The chateau was sold at auction for roughly 1/7 of its actual value. Baker was on tour when the sale was finalized, and when she learned that the new owner intended to develop the property immediately. She came back to Les Milandes and barricaded herself inside the kitchen. The new owner's men cut the electricity and the heat. When she went outside briefly to collect water, they locked her out. The photographs from that day are among the most well-known images of her later life. She is sitting on the stone steps of the chateau in a dressing gown, surrounded by a few damp boxes of belongings, in a state of shock so deep she had to be taken to hospital. She was 62 years old, and she was sitting on the doorstep of a dream she had spent 20 years building, locked out of it by a padlock. The image ran in newspapers across France and across the world. People who had known her in the glory years, who had seen the photographs of 12 laughing children in that garden, who had driven down the roads of the Dordogne past signs pointing toward the village of the world, looked at that photograph and felt something collapse. She told reporters afterward that France had let her down, that after everything she had done, during the war, during the years of building something extraordinary in the Dordogne, she had been reduced to begging on the steps of her own home. The sale included a clause allowing Baker to remain on the estate for the remainder of the year. In 1969, she left for good. The children had been sent ahead, dispersed to boarding schools in the Paris region, to Bouillon's niece's apartment, to Bouillon himself in Argentina. They took a train from the station at Sarlat to Paris Austerlitz. One account says that before they left, the children climbed the spiral staircase in the corner tower of the chateau and scratched their initials into the stone wall. Small letters in the dark, proof that something had been there. Princess Grace of Monaco, Grace Kelly, who had become one of Baker's closest friends after years of correspondence and visits, and who had walked out of the Stork Club in New York decades earlier in solidarity with Baker when she was refused service, stepped in once more. She found Baker and the children an apartment in Roquebrune, near Monaco, and provided the financial support needed to stabilize the situation. The woman who had been the most celebrated entertainer in Europe was 62, in poor health, with 12 children and no home, being housed by a princess who had never stopped believing in her. Baker went back on stage. It was the only thing she knew how to do, and it was the only thing that still worked. But the children she went back on stage to support had already begun to move in directions she could not control or predict. And for some of them, the years ahead would be very hard. The lives that followed. The rainbow tribe scattered after Les Mélandes, the way any family scatters when the place that held them together is gone, gradually, in different directions, carrying different things. Some went to live with Bouillon in Buenos Aires. Others stayed in Paris. Baker moved between Monaco and Paris, performing to keep them all financially afloat. The chateau that had been the centre of their shared world became a museum, and then something the older children sometimes returned to, walking through the rooms where they had grown up, looking at the photographs on the walls, being recognized by strangers who knew their faces from the old newsreels. Akio, the eldest, the Japanese boy who had been the first, settled in Paris and became the family's most public face in later life. He has spoken in interviews about the beetles he used to catch in the garden as a child and tie strings to, carrying them around like living balloons. About the trips to see the Pope. About the summer in Cuba. He has carried the memory of the golden years alongside an adult understanding of what those years actually cost. And he has done so publicly, on behalf of siblings who mostly haven't. Jari, the Finnish boy who was sent to Argentina at 15, eventually made his way to New York. In 1995, a Finnish journalist tracked down his birth mother and 4 siblings, and Jari was reunited with the family he had never known. He had grown up at Les Mélandes without speaking Finnish. When he met his birth mother for the first time, they needed a translator to talk to each other. He maintained relationships with both families from that point on. In New York, Jari found Jean-Claude, the man who would come to be known as Josephine Baker's unofficial 13th child. Jean-Claude was not one of the 12 adopted children. He had been born in Dijon in 1943, abandoned by his father, and had ended up working as a teenage bellhop at the Hotel Scribe in Paris at the age of 14, where he met Josephine Baker. She became his legal guardian and the center of his life's work. He took her surname. He came to New York in the 1970s and in 1986 opened Chez Josephine on West 42nd Street in Manhattan's Theatre Row, a restaurant filled floor to ceiling with photographs and memorabilia, warm and theatrical, a place that felt like a deliberate echo of what Les Milandes had tried to be, a table where everyone was welcome. Jarry joined him there and worked alongside him for years. In 2015, Jean-Claude Baker was found at his home in East Hampton. He was 71 years old. He had been struggling with depression in the months before his death and had grown increasingly lonely despite the 1,000 friends he was said to have. He died by his own hand at a house outside the city on January 15th, 2015. He left behind the restaurant, the memorabilia collection, the 1993 biography he had co-written, Josephine, The Hungry Heart, which remains to this day the most thorough and most honest account of Baker's life ever published. He had spent 3 decades gathering it, interview by interview, refusing to sentimentalize the woman he loved. Jarry took over the restaurant after Jean-Claude's death. He has continued to run it, working the room the way his brother used to, welcoming strangers who come in through the door on 42nd Street because of a woman who is still, somehow, drawing people toward her 50 years after she died. The ones who got lost. Not every story from the Rainbow Tribe leads somewhere you can follow easily. Moïse, the French-born boy Baker had raised as Jewish, the one who carried a faith that had been assigned to him rather than inherited, died in 1999 after a long battle with cancer. He was in his mid-40s. He had lived quietly and mostly out of public view after the family dispersed, and the world knew little of what his adult life had looked like. What's been confirmed is that the illness was long and difficult, and that he did not appear to have a family of his own when it ended. And then there is Noel. Noel was found as an infant in a crib on a Parisian street on Christmas Eve. Baker took him in and named him for the night of his discovery. He grew up at Les Milandes, one of 12, photographed and documented, and held up as evidence that the world could do better. He was raised alongside children from Japan and Colombia and Finland and the Ivory Coast, in a limestone chateau that looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale. In adulthood, Noel was diagnosed with schizophrenia. As of 2009, the last time his situation was publicly reported, he was living in a psychiatric institution, the name and location of which has not been made public. There is something particularly difficult about sitting with Noel's story. He was found alone on a winter street, with no name and no family, and he was given both. He was given 12 brothers and sisters, a chateau, private tutors, trips abroad, a life that looked, from the photographs, like something extraordinary. And then the chateau was sold, and the family scattered, and the dream ended. And he ended up in an institution, far from all of it, in a room that no tourist will ever pay to visit. What his life felt like from the inside, the record doesn't say. It rarely does, for the people in these stories whose voices don't survive. The others, Brian, Coffee, Luis, Marianne, Mara, Stelina, Jeannot, have lived quietly and largely out of public view. Brian, the Algerian boy born to Berber parents, has returned to the chateau as a museum with his brother Akio and given occasional interviews. He remembered a mother who was strict but warm when she was present, and who had noticed, during a late-night visit to a nursery on one of her tours, that he and she shared the same birthday. She took that as a sign and took him home. That's the kind of story the golden years were made of. Marianne, the first daughter, and Stellina, the last of all 12, have said very little publicly. Most of the children, once Les Milans was gone, chose the kind of quiet that their childhoods had never once allowed them. The final curtain. In the years after Les Milans, Baker went back to work and did not stop. She performed at the Olympia in Paris in 1968. She performed in Belgrade. She performed at Carnegie Hall in 1973. The city that had once told her she was too dark to be a featured player, now giving her standing ovations that shook the room. She performed at the Royal Variety Performance at the London Palladium in 1974. She was 67 and 68, and still giving performances that critics called some of the great theatrical events of the decade. In August 1963, before Les Milans fell and the tribe scattered, she had stood at the podium at the March on Washington, wearing her Free French uniform from the war, the Légion d'honneur pinned to her chest, and spoken just before Martin Luther King gave the speech that the world still remembers. She was the only woman to give an official address at the march. She told the crowd that she had walked into the palaces of kings and presidents, but could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee. She said she'd opened her big mouth about it. She said when Josephine Baker opens her mouth, they hear it all over the world. After King's assassination in 1968, Coretta Scott King approached Baker and asked her to consider taking on the informal leadership of the civil rights movement. Baker declined. She said she was too old and that her children needed her. In April 1975, Princess Grace helped finance a comeback show at the Bobino Theatre in Paris. Josefina Bobino, 1975, celebrating 50 years of Baker's career. The advance tickets sold out within hours. The opening night on April 8th was triumphant. Critics ran out of superlatives. Audience members who were there said they had the sense of watching something final, not because anything was wrong, but because it was so perfectly itself that it seemed complete. 2 days later, on April 10th, Baker was found unresponsive in her apartment. She had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage during the night. She was taken to the Salpêtrière hospital. She never regained consciousness. She died on April 12th, 1975. She was 68 years old. Her funeral was held at the Church of La Madeleine in Paris on April 15th. Thousands of people lined the streets outside. She was given a 21-gun salute, the only American-born woman to receive full French military honors at her funeral. She was buried in Monaco, at the Cimetière de Monaco, close to the apartment Princess Grace had given her, in the country that had taken her in when France closed its doors. In November 2021, President Emmanuel Macron inducted Josephine Baker into the Pantheon in Paris, the mausoleum that holds the remains of France's most honored figures, Voltaire, Victor Hugo, Marie Curie. She was the first black woman and the first American-born person to receive that distinction. Her surviving children were in attendance. A symbolic urn was placed in the Pantheon. Her body remained in Monaco, where it had been for 46 years. She was, as she had always been, in 2 places at once. What the 12 were left with. There is a question that runs through the entire story of the Rainbow Tribe, and that nobody who has written about it has fully resolved. What did those 12 children actually receive? And what did they give up in exchange? They received a home. A limestone chateau with gardens and a swimming pool and private tutors. 12 siblings from across the world. A mother who, by the accounts of the children who have spoken about her, was genuinely warm when she was present, who found Brian because they shared a birthday and called it destiny, who named Noel for the night she found him, who photographed all of them constantly and told journalists that her children were her greatest achievement. They also received the weight of being a symbol, of being dressed in the costumes of their assigned national identities and exhibited to the 300,000 visitors who came through Les Milandes every year, of having their histories adjusted, in some cases, to serve the symbolic arrangement Baker needed. Jano's Korean birth quietly reshaped into a Japanese identity. Moise's faith assigned rather than discovered. These were children who grew up knowing that their existence together was making an argument to the world before they were old enough to decide whether they wanted to make that argument. And then Les Milandes was sold, and they scattered, and the world stopped watching. Jarry found a kind of peace in New York, tending a restaurant on 42nd Street that carries his mother's name and his brother's memory in equal measure. He has said that running it is, in some sense, a form of reconciliation, not only with what Baker was, but with what she failed to be. He knows both things. He holds both things. That is perhaps its own kind of proof of something. Akio became the family's keeper of history, returning to the chateau that is now a museum, walking the floors and answering questions from visitors who want to know what it was like. He tells them, Jean-Claude spent 3 decades writing the most honest book anyone ever wrote about Josephine Baker, and then he was gone. Moise died in his 40s. Noel is in an institution somewhere. The others are living lives the cameras don't follow anymore. The chateau still stands above the Dordogne Valley. The stained glass windows still catch the light the way they did when Josephine Baker first saw them in the 1930s and decided, in that instant, that it was hers. The J-shaped swimming pool is still there. The wax museum is gone, but the rooms where 12 children slept are still there. Their little cots preserved for visitors who pay to walk through and imagine what it was like. The initials the children scratched into the stone of the corner tower in 1968 are still there, if you know where to look. What they remember of the place is more complicated than the photographs suggest. It always is. But the love between them, 12 people from 12 different places who grew up eating at the same table and arguing over the same toys and swimming in the same J-shaped pool, is real. The family, even scattered, even broken in some places, survived. That much. Among everything she got right and wrong, and somewhere in between, she got right. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.